Hello, my name is Ryan Clark and I have a company called Advocacy Solutions. We teach and train people how to be effective advocates on their own behalf. I've been asked by the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation to put together this Introduction to Advocacy session as a resource for parents and family members of NICU babies and graduates. The objective of this session is to better empower you through advocacy to engage with hospitals, healthcare professionals, and other institutions and individuals to bring about the change you require around the challenges you face. I hope you will find this content valuable. Here's an overview of what I'd like to speak with you about. These slides are meant to provide you with a good introduction to the core concepts of advocacy. And while I'll be concentrating my comments on advocating to government, because in any advocacy campaign you need what we call a target. Who is the person or what is the entity that can bring about the change that you require? The concepts I'll be discussing today work equally as well whether you're advocating to your elected representative, your child's healthcare professional, or your local hospital. The principles are exactly the same. So again, while I'll be talking about advocating to government, please think about how you can use these same principles and apply them to your circumstances. So why should you listen to what I have to say about advocacy? What qualifies me as an expert? Well, the short answer is because I've spent my entire career doing advocacy from one or a number of different perspectives. I started off my career practicing family law, so I was a litigator in court, representing my clients in the context of a legal proceeding. And of course, that's where I learned how to represent people in that regard. From there, I went and worked in government. I worked as a policy advisor to a minister. And that's where I learned how to practice what I call reverse advocacy. Most people think of stakeholders and others trying to influence government through advocacy. But what they don't realize is that government also practices advocacy, this idea of reverse advocacy, in which they advocate out from government to stakeholders to manage the stakeholder community. And that's what I did in the context of my work. From there, I went and worked in the pharmaceutical industry as a lobbyist. In fact, I lobbied the person who took my job in government. I mention this to you because in order to be a really effective advocate, you not only need to understand your side or your perspective of the issue, but you also need to understand the other side's perspective of the issue equally as well, so that you can, in essence, argue both sides. And then finally, just over 14 years ago, I started this business, Advocacy Solutions, which, as I mentioned, is focused on teaching and training people how to be effective advocates on their own behalf. Let's start at the beginning. What is advocacy? Well, it's verbal support or argument for a cause or a policy. That's a dictionary definition that I'm not terribly fond of, so I've come up with one that I think is a little bit easier to understand. It's telling your story to someone, and in this case the someone will be government, through various means with the express purpose of compelling them to do, or in some cases not to do something. It is a process. This is the first really important point I want to mention. It is a process that almost always takes time to realize tangible results. It's not this idea that, well, we met with our member of parliament once, but she wasn't very helpful, so I guess advocacy doesn't work. A meeting is not a process. That's a single interaction, a moment in time, and that's not advocacy. Advocacy is built up of a series of interactions over a period of time that result in change. There is no one way to do it. It's very personal to your own style or your own comfort level. And finally, advocacy is about empowerment. It's exerting some form of control and initiating some form of action around an issue that matters to you, to your family, or to a loved one. Why is advocacy important? Well, if you remember nothing else, you simply need to remember this, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's politics, that's government, that's any large institutional or bureaucratic structure in which you find yourself engaged, and in fact it's life. People who make noise make change. People who say nothing don't make change. Advocacy is also important because if I work in government or if I work in any institution and there's an issue that is affecting you and you haven't made yourself known to me, then I'm not going to be able to help you. I'm not going to be able to do anything because I don't even know who you are. So this idea is that you need to engage in the process. You need to be known to decision makers in order to get what it is that you need. So what I typically tell people is you have a very clear choice. Do something and something may change. Do nothing and nothing will change. And finally, advocacy is important because governments and other institutions will simply do what they want unless people intervene in the process. Different kinds of advocacy. For people new to the world of advocacy, it's often personal change, or almost always personal change, that will compel one to take action. You're not looking to change the world, you just want to help yourself or a loved one. But it's out of this personal need that some people start to realize they have an opportunity to bring about larger public policy change by advocating for broadly based issues. And the people that do that, I describe them as having graduated. It's actually very simple. You enter into the healthcare system and you realize that it has its challenges, it has its problems. Now, most people will simply engage in the system, experience these challenges and problems, and then go home after a day, a week, a month, or however long it takes. But other people who get engaged in the process start to think to themselves, well, wait a minute, if we're having this problem, or if our family's having this problem, then other families must be having this problem. And what if we could solve the larger problem, we could help more people? Those are people who, as I said, I describe as having graduated. They see the world beyond themselves. And my point here is that for those people that graduate, and most people never will, they have the ability to not only change public policy or health policy in this country, I've seen them make health policy. It's really quite astounding what people can do when they choose to see the world beyond just the immediacy of their own challenges. The essence of good advocacy. These 4 bullet points represent the foundation. If any one of these elements is missing, you're going to have a difficult time starting to engage in advocacy, let alone get better at it. I don't have time in the context of this presentation to go through all of these pieces individually, but I will focus now on two foundational pieces of effective advocacy. Those two pieces are the ability to prepare and share your personal story, and building and sustaining impeccable relationships with decision makers. The first key, or the first cornerstone to advocacy, is the personal story. It is the ability to craft your personal story and to deliver that personal story, either in writing or orally, to the decision maker to whom you're advocating. And the reason why this is so critically important is because it is the only part of your circumstance in which you can attempt to connect with the decision maker as a human being, to bring your situation to life in a way that person, or the person to whom you're advocating, can understand. I cannot overemphasize the importance, the critical importance of having a personal story and delivering it in such a way to be able to make that connection. The second cornerstone or key to advocacy is relationships. If you have established and built relationships with the people that help you achieve your advocacy objectives, you will be in a much better position for success. It's this idea that you don't ask somebody for something when you don't even know them. You invest in relationships, you build relationships, you get to know people, decision makers, whoever they may be, and then when you need something, when you need help and you go to them and you say, I need you to do something, you're going to be in a much better position than if they have no clue who you are. Now let's shift to the process for developing an effective advocacy plan. And it's a three-step process that's set out there as key message development, development of your tools, and development of your one ask. This plan you can use to implement in support of your issues. It's very practical, so we're finished with the theory of advocacy, and it doesn't require substantial resources. But it does require three things I think it's important to take a moment to mention. Number one, it requires time. You can't change the world by devoting 5 minutes a year to your cause. It won't work. I'm not here to tell you how much time to spend on a particular issue, but I will tell you that time, which is something few of us have a lot of, is a critical part of being able to make change because, as I mentioned earlier, it is a process. It's not just a moment in time. Secondly, a commitment. A commitment is a conversation you have with yourself in your head or amongst your family members, for example, in which you say, look, we are committed to making this change. We will not stop until the change is achieved. And then finally, a willingness to start and stick with it, whatever it is that you're trying to do. Starting is easy. We're very good at starting things. But sticking with it, that's a huge challenge. It is extremely difficult sometimes in the context of advocacy to get up every day, every week, every month, over and over again to try to affect change when sometimes you have no idea if you're even making progress. But as I told you earlier, the choice is clear. If you stop, then it's over. So you kind of have no choice. If you want the change, you need to keep going. But sticking with it is a huge challenge, but it needs to be the way in which you decide going in, we're going to make sure that we don't stop. Your key messages. Politicians as a group tend to know a little bit about a number of different things. And that's not a criticism, that's an accurate reflection of their jobs and the jobs of many healthcare professionals and other decision makers. And they are required to deal with many different issues every day. This requires you as an advocate to simplify as much as possible the issues that you put before them. But I'm not talking about dumbing it down. I'm talking about conveying the core elements in a compact manner. Conveying the core elements of what they need to know in a compact manner. And you do that by delivering your key messages. More specifically, you should have 3 key messages that explain the salient points of your issue in simple language. In fact, your 3 key messages should tell almost a self-contained story. That's not your personal story we talked about earlier, but the point is the key messages should flow one into another, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by that in a moment. Your key messages will be unique to your issues and to your circumstances. When I design key messages, I use something called the 14-year-old boy test. It's called the 14-year-old boy test because it doesn't work with girls. They're too smart. You need a boy. We have 3 boys, so I know what I'm speaking about. If you can deliver your 3 key messages to a 14-year-old boy, it doesn't matter what the issue is, it doesn't matter how complicated it is, and he has some clue what you're talking about, you have conveyed the core elements in a compact manner. On the other hand, if you deliver your 3 key messages to a 14-year-old boy and he has no clue what you're talking about, you have not conveyed the core elements in a compact manner. My point is that it is your responsibility as an advocate to ensure that the person who you're advocating to understands the issue at a level that is very, very basic and is not overly complicated. As it says, they should be clear, compelling, concise, and consistent key messages. If you stick to those 4 C's, then you'll achieve that idea of coming in at the level that a 14-year-old boy can understand. So here's a model for your consideration. When we talk about developing key messages, we'll often talk about the first one describing what is the problem, what is the issue, what are we here to talk about, what is the challenge. And so you try to encapsulate that in the first key message to set the tone for everything that's to come. But it's not enough that you tell the decision maker there's a problem. You need to illustrate what the impact of the problem is, and that's your second key message. To illustrate why this is, as I say, a big deal. Having a problem is not enough. You have to say, here's the impact of the problem. And then finally, what would it look like if we solved or didn't solve the problem? We try to stay positive, so we try to answer the question, what would it look like if we solved the problem? And then that final key message is the bridge to what we call your ask. So the idea is this. You say, here's the problem. Here's the impact of the problem. This is what it would look like if we solve the problem. Bridge over to, and as a result, I need you to do this, whatever it is you need that person to do in the context of your one ask, which we'll talk about in a moment. The second step are your advocacy tools, the means of delivering your key messages. So once you've got your 3 key messages, this represents the core of any effective advocacy strategy. Anything that you have or produce that may be used to communicate with people is a potential tool. And I realize that's rather vague, but it includes things like face-to-face meetings, letters, emails, websites, petitions, and on the next 2 slides, I will show you some examples for your own reference of the kinds of tools that we use. I mentioned that advocacy was a process. I want to break it down for you a little bit more in the context of the 3 words you see there: educate, demonstrate, advocate. The first thing you need to do if you're going to advocate to anybody about anything is you need to educate them about your issue, and you do that by delivering your 3 key messages we just talked about. The second thing you need to do is you need to demonstrate why your issue is important. Now, this is where most people make a mistake. They book a meeting with a decision maker or whoever it may be that can affect the change they require, and they spend the entire time telling the decision maker or convincing the decision maker that their issue, or the issue that affects your family, is important to you. Of course it is. You really don't need to spend a moment trying to convince somebody that an issue with respect to your child is important to you. Of course it is. You need to spend the entire time trying to demonstrate why the issue that is impacting you or your family or your child must be important to the decision maker, the person to whom you're advocating. Showing them what's in it for them, as it were, for them to help you or do something to assist you. So when we talk about demonstrating, we talk about demonstrating why your issue is important to others, not convincing others that your issue is important to you. And finally, advocate. That's your one ask, which we'll get to in a moment. Educate, demonstrate, advocate. 3 steps. You can't do them out of order. You can't skip a step. That's the way they flow. So here's the first slide around some sample advocacy tools that we use for your consideration. And then here's the second slide with some further tools that you can use, including social media, which of course has become critically important in the context of the advocacy work that's being done today by many individuals and organizations. And now finally, your one ask, the third step. The whole reason we do advocacy is to get to this slide, to get to this moment. Because you're going to ask for the one thing you need and not a list of what you want. Let me say that again because those words have been chosen very specifically. You're going to ask for the one thing you need and not a list of what you want. Advocacy is not Christmas. It's not an opportunity to ask a decision maker for everything you've ever wanted. It is only an opportunity, or should only be an opportunity, for you to ask for the one thing that you need. Now, you may need more than one thing. That's fine, but you can only ask for one thing at a time. That's the whole point. It's also important to remember that in the context of the one thing that you need, you will have to do some measure of what we call due diligence to determine what that thing is, so that you can demonstrate very clearly why this is a need and not a want, and something that absolutely must be done. So again, in this case, less is definitely more, and you cannot be too focused or too specific in an ask. You can absolutely not get too granular when it comes to doing this kind of work. In fact, the more specific it is, the better it is. And that brings me to the last point on this slide, but it's critically important. Your ask needs to be tangible. This is not an ask. We need your support, because support is not a thing. You can't bring me a plate of support. We need your help. Help is not a thing. It's not tangible. You can't bring me a cup of help. In fact, all of the words that politicians typically use to make a living, hope, support, commitment, are, in my opinion, the enemies of advocacy because they don't mean anything. Your ask needs to be tangible. It needs to be a thing. This is an ask. For example, to a local member of Parliament. I need you to write a letter on my behalf to the Minister of Health stating the following 3 things. That's an ask, because a letter is a thing. It's tangible. You can see it. You can feel it. If you can't see it, if you can't feel it, it's not advocacy. And many people make the mistake of designing wonderful key messages, delivering them through a number of different tools, and then when they get to this moment, they don't ask for something tangible. They don't ask for something real. And that is the essence of what we're trying to do here, is make a tangible change, not something that isn't tangible and doesn't mean anything. Implementing an effective advocacy strategy. To build on what I said earlier, I can train people how to do this work, I can help them develop strategies, and I can help them to implement those strategies, but nobody can do this work as well as you can. All of the people that we've been talking about today, politicians, for example, who impact our lives and the lives of the people that you care about, are public servants paid by our tax dollars. And you have every right to advocate to them for change. And I don't just pick that word right out of thin air. I'm talking about a right under Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which talks about freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. You have a right to do what I described in this context and in these slides to decision makers in government. In fact, this right attaches to you as a citizen. You couldn't get rid of it if you wanted to from a legal perspective. So you are empowered and entitled to be able to do this kind of work. And finally, in summary, let me draw your attention to the last bullet on this slide. Government wins when you give up, so never give up. And whether it's government or any other person that you're advocating to, they win, in essence, when you give up, so never give up. It's very easy to say, it's tough to do, but it is the truest thing that I can say to you in the context of this work. In fact, one of the biggest challenges I have in this work, doing this work in Canada, is that advocating for change is not very Canadian. In fact, it's very un-Canadian. And I say that in the context of our political foundation. This country was founded on the idea of peace, order, and good government. Those words are in the British North America Act of 1867. Peace, order, and good government are not words that are a recipe for change or advocacy. And yet, you have a protected right to be able to do this kind of work when you choose to engage advocacy, when you choose to engage decision makers in advocacy. So, I would encourage you to utilize the foundational pieces I mentioned, your personal stories and relationships. Pair them up with the 3 steps we talked about, key messages, your advocacy tools, and your one ask, and use all of that to go out and be an effective advocate and make the change that you require on behalf of yourself, your child, your family, or anybody for whom you're trying to engage. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I appreciate you taking the time to do so.